Welcome to this component which focuses on how to identify barriers for non-market technologies. The last component was focusing on barriers for market technologies, which we find on this side of the screen. This component will focus on non-market technologies, which we find on this side of the screen. Non-market technologies consist of two categories: publicly provided goods and non-market goods. What is special for these two groups is that governments exercise influence for implementation of these technologies through project and procurement, whereas for the market goods over here, governments exercise their influence for diffusion of these technologies through enabling frameworks. The content of this presentation is divided into publicly provided goods and other non-market goods, the two main categories, and other market goods are subdivided into technologies provided by institutions, into institutional change, and into behavioral change. Publicly provided goods are generally large infrastructure projects with large capital investments, which may depend on donor funding and which always are dependent on political decisions at government level, as for example in this case of a mass transport system. These type of investments will always be preceded by socio-economic cost-benefit analysis, by environmental impact analysis. Due to their size, the impact of these projects will always touch a large group of actors. And what is important to note is that positive and negative impacts are not equally shared among different groups in society. To explain that, I will take the example of large hydro dams, where we know that we often see resettlement of especially the poorest groups of the population, the rural poor. We see loss of tourist sites, which will influence the income of another group of people in society, and we find lower electricity prices, which will be to the benefit of the consumers, but mainly the consumers in urban areas or industrial enterprises. And we may find employment effects locally through the construction phase and the operation phase, but maybe also at a more general level in society due to the lower electricity prices. When we look at barriers for publicly provided goods, we divide them into two groups: barriers to the procurement of the technology and barriers to the long-term sustainability of the technology. Barriers to procurement will arise already at the initial project idea stage. It can be no feasibility studies available. It can be lack of cost-benefit analysis or environmental impact analysis, which may be an important barrier at this stage. There might also be resistance by local people and NGO, which we have seen with many hydropower plants. At the financing stage, another barrier might be little interest by international donors in engaging in this type of project. And at the tendering phase, it might be that there are few potential independent power producers who want to engage in this, or few bigger companies wanting to engage with the government in public-private partnerships. There might be few technology suppliers, and with the result that there will be little competition, and there might be a low level of stability and trust in society as a whole. When we look at the barriers to long-term sustainability, there would often be challenges regarding operation and maintenance of the technology. We would see non-transparent political involvement in state-owned companies. We might see politically set tariffs which do not allow for full cost recovery, and we might see non-payment of services delivered to government institutions. Continuing to the other main group, other non-market goods, we will look at the first subgroup, technologies provided by public institutions. Examples of technologies in this group are early warning systems for drought, seasonal weather forecast systems, new vaccination systems, or generic screening systems for pathogens. Barriers to the implementation of this type of technologies would be few feasibility studies and cost-benefit analysis available. It might be that costs are higher than the benefits, or a difficult access to finance. Turning to the barriers to long-term sustainability, we would find, for example, poor management traditions, few national resources for operation of the technologies, and a limited qualified personnel. Turning to the next subgroup, institutional change. Examples would be microfinance institutions, forest management groups, or village development groups. Barriers to the implementation of these technologies would be the mixed experience with interventions of this kind, that costs might be higher than the benefits, and it could be difficult to have access to funding of this type of technologies. Barriers to the long-term sustainability would, according to the literature, be capture by local elites. It could be dispute over local resources, it could be misappropriation of funds, and even strategies of dependence by the institutions Turning to behavioral change, which is the last of the three subgroups, examples would be changing farming practices, could be turning off light or air conditioning when you're not available. It could be cars, changing from cars to public transport and bicycles, and it could be use of existing mosquito nets. Barriers to the implementation of these technologies could be few product proposals available, a low understanding of success factors, and a limited funding opportunities available. But what are the barriers to actually achieving change? They are in fact multiple, and they are complex and difficult to overcome. And this is because they are culturally embedded practices. It can be convenience, it can be pride, and it can be social esteem. It would, for example, be convenient for a consultant to use his car instead of the bicycle, but he might also continue to use his car because it's giving him a lower social esteem if he is arriving to the client on a bicycle, and it might even touch his pride to be arriving on a bicycle. So it could also be change of tradition and religious beliefs, which we all know are difficult. So summing up, this presentation has touched upon the barriers for publicly provided goods and for other non-market goods. We have looked at three subgroups: technologies provided by institutions, institutional change, and behavioral change. What is special for this group, this non-market technology group, is that government and donors take decisions directly on their implementation. And it means that barriers are very different than for market goods. And therefore, we have looked into barriers for implementation and barriers for long-term sustainability. If you want to go more into details on barriers for non-market goods, you could consult Chapter 5 of the second edition of the guidebook, available at our webpage.